So you believe that all of this was faked? No, really. If you've tuned into this, I really hope that you believe that the moon landing was faked, because I'm legitimately going to have an opportunity to address this issue with people who really believe this. And I, in all honesty, have decided to give a fair opportunity to the hero of the faked moon landing conspiracy theory school of thought, Bart Sibrel, who recently got an opportunity to make his case on a very large podcasting YouTube channel, well, much bigger than mine anyway. And when he got the opportunity to climb up onto this very public and popular platform, he spent over 2 hours making his case. So was he successful? Did he convince people? Well, given how many books this guy has sold, I think he's actually convinced quite a number of people, but I think it's very important to listen to the scientific facts, quote unquote, that this man shared online a couple of days ago to see if there's anything to this theory. Did the government, conspiring with special effects wizards in Hollywood, manage to pull off the biggest con in the history of the human species? Good morning, viewers, and welcome to episode 4 of Alien Week. And this time I'm taking a bit of a departure from my usual content, I guess mostly to demonstrate to the viewers just how far my conspiracy theory brain actually goes. So I thought I would at least give a fair shake to the folks who advocate for this theory, the idea that somehow NASA was able to fake the moon landings in the late 1960s and early 1970s, commissioned really good special effects masters of the time, the same people, of course, responsible for 2001: A Space Odyssey. Definitely, there was some extremely good special effects teams who were available in those days, so I certainly wouldn't put it past the capability of these people to fake a moon landing, assuming that there weren't a lot of other factors to be considered. Nevertheless, I thought it might be a good idea to actually hear one of these people out, hear out the hero of the faked moon landing conspiracy theory, the individual who's made quite a lot of money selling books to unsuspecting and uninformed people about this particular theory. Yeah, I'm sure you're beginning to pick up on this right now, that I don't subscribe to this idea at all, but I have to tell you that from the very moment I started listening, actually from some of the earliest arguments that this guy made, it was immediately apparent to me that either he didn't understand his science at all, or he is just intentionally trying to mislead people who also don't know their science at all. We're going to start out with something that he just simply said about the stars and the fact that you can't see the stars in any of the Apollo photographs, Apollo footage, anything like that. How is that possible? How could you not see the stars on the moon? Before I go any further, let's just go ahead and hear what he has to say about this particular issue. What's up with the stars on the moon?
What was the confusion during the press conference with Michael Collins talking about the stars? Because he was like, I think it was Buzz who said he didn't remember, or was that Neil Armstrong who said he didn't remember? And then Michael Collins was like, I never saw stars.
Right. Well, the fact is, you should be able to see beautiful stars, more beautiful than you've ever seen before from the surface of the moon. But they couldn't fake the astrological position of the constellation. So they were told, don't talk about it. And when the people say, well, why aren't there any stars in the picture? They say, well, the aperture was closed for the bright surface, and that is why they don't show it.
That would make sense, right?
Not actually. They used to have on their website a picture of the space shuttle at sunrise, and it's pretty bright, and you still see the stars in the background.
Really?
Yeah. But you can't find that anymore. They took it off because it contradicts what they're saying.
Okay, so I'd like you to do a real quick experiment for me, all right? Just to demonstrate why you can't see the stars in the Apollo footage. Go out to the most remote area you can think of, all right? Go to an area where there's no light pollution, where a view of the stars should be as spectacular as possible. And at high noon, walk outside and look up. Do you see any stars? No. Why? Because the sun is out. Excuse me. So some would argue that, yeah, but the Earth's atmosphere makes it to where the sun blots out the stars. If it wasn't for the atmosphere, then you would be able to see stars. That is completely untrue, and I'll have you do another experiment to prove my point. Go outside at night when there's a full moon. Do you see as many stars as you would on a night where there is no full moon? No. And that's because the full moon provides a tremendous amount of light pollution that washes out some of the stars. Now, if you take the sun, which is thousands of times brighter than the moon, and also factor in the reflectivity of the lunar surface in this footage, because the moon has a fairly high albedo, reflects a fair amount of light between the sun and reflected light from the moon's surface that's going to wash out all the stars. And by the way, this is the same reason that you can't see any stars in a lot of ISS footage, because the sun is out. It's only at times when the sun is hiding behind the Earth that any stars might be visible. But at the same time, even under those circumstances, the reflected light from the Earth and the Earth's albedo is much, much higher than the moon's is. That light is tremendous as well and can wash out stars. You would have to be facing away from the ISS, away from the Earth, and preferably at a time when there is no reflected light from the Earth as well. Those opportunities don't come up very often. At that point, yes, you can see some very spectacular stars, but under most other circumstances in space, it is, ironically, a little difficult to see stars. And again, that's simply because the sun is always there, blotting it out. Again, unless you have something shading sunlight, or if you're just facing away from the sun while you're in space. And that's something that the Apollo astronauts didn't have the luxury of doing. For one thing, they landed on the lunar surface in the middle of the day, for the lunar day, that is, which lasts 2 weeks, because they had to take advantage of the better temperatures. The temperatures at night are incredibly cold compared to the temperatures during the day. And they also needed light in order to be able to see where they were going, where they were landing, because these landings were being handled manually. Things weren't as automated back then. Neil Armstrong looked out the window of Apollo 11 just to try to spot a good landing site, something he absolutely couldn't have done during the lunar night. None of the Apollo missions landed on the moon during the night. Daytime was always by far the safest time to land on the moon. And this is going to be an extreme challenge for Artemis astronauts. So, okay, let's talk about other things besides light here. Let's talk about the Van Allen radiation belts, okay? These very deadly, very nasty radiation belts that are going to melt the flesh off of the astronauts' bones as they try to pass through them. Are the Van Allen belts really that deadly?
Oh, there's an image, if you want to show it, of the radiation belt, you see. Every manned mission has been below it, except going to the moon. You'd have to go through it.
There's been no astronauts that have been anywhere near that.
No, except going to the moon. You'd have to go through it to the moon and through it on the way back. And the clip we're about to see is NASA's own engineer saying the technology necessary to go to the moon and back through the radiation has not been invented yet. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space, meaning the challenges of radiation protection have not been invented yet. Go ahead and play the clip.
Smith, and I work on navigation and guidance for Orion. We are headed 3,600 miles above Earth, 15 times higher from the planet than the International Space Station. As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. We won't have astronauts inside. We won't have astronauts inside. We won't have astronauts inside.
So, you may have noticed that clip was edited. Clip was edited. Clip was edited. There's a variety of radiation challenges that astronauts are going to have to deal with when they leave the protection of Earth's magnetic field, not least of which are cosmic rays, solar radiation, solar storms. Radiation will be a problem, but not nearly the problem that's being described here. And just to be clear, there has been a mission into the Van Allen radiation belt since Apollo. It happened just a few months ago. Jared Isaacman and 3 other private astronauts with SpaceX carried out the first ever private spacewalk, but the other objective of this mission was to travel on a very elongated elliptical orbit that would take the Crew Dragon into the Van Allen belts in order to measure the radiation levels there. Granted, they didn't travel all the way through the Van Allen belts, but they traveled into them. Unless, of course, Jared Isaacman and his 3 co-conspirators are part of the cover-up too. Man, this cover-up's getting big. And by the way, do you notice something about this footage? No stars. But let's go ahead and talk about the science of the Van Allen belts just to see how deadly the whole thing is. The red areas of the Van Allen belts are indeed quite deadly, 0.05 rads per second, but it drops off radically in the orange and yellow areas, the orange being 0.01 rads per second and the yellow being 0.005 rads per second, then green at 0.001 rads, blue at 0.0001 rads. What does all of that mean? Well, it takes 400 rads worth of exposure in a relatively short amount of time to give somebody fatal radiation sickness. Now, if you were in the red zone of the Van Allen belts for a solid hour, yeah, that would probably be pretty nasty. Not 400 rads, but about 180. So if you were to sit in those red zones for a long period of time, yeah, it would be pretty nasty indeed. But of course, that's not going to happen. Your average Earth to Moon transit is going to be traveling at about 25,000 kilometers per hour. It will blow right through the more deadly parts of the Van Allen belt in much less than an hour and won't be lingering in the red areas for more than a few minutes, assuming that the ship travels through the red zones at all. What is brought up several times during this podcast is the fact that you would have to travel directly up from the North or South poles in order to completely avoid the Van Allen belts. But as you can see from the diagram, you don't have to completely avoid them. You just have to avoid the more deadly regions of the Van Allen belts, which doesn't require a trajectory that takes you way out over the North or South poles. An entire hour in the orange sector of the Van Allen belts, again, that's a real worst case scenario, but let's just assume that that happens. That would be a 36 rad experience, less than 10% of the rads that are necessary to give you a pretty nasty version of radiation sickness. But there's something else to keep in mind. This is assuming that the astronauts were traveling through the Van Allen belts completely unprotected, which they weren't. Even though the capsules only had thin layers of aluminum and stainless steel protecting them from the vacuum of space, that would have been sufficient to at least provide some shielding. They wouldn't have been completely exposed to the radiation. So the figures that I've given you up to this point are unprotected figures. If you drop that down based on even a minor amount of radiation shielding, yeah, it's not something you would want to do every day, but definitely something that the Apollo astronauts could have done on a one-time basis. And what this engineer was talking about in this cleverly edited piece of NASA footage is that if we are going to be traveling repeatedly through the Van Allen belt, sending astronauts to and from the moon on a regular basis, 5, 6, maybe even 10 times, then yes, we need to come up with better radiation shielding than what we have right now for a variety of different reasons. Had there been a significant solar particle event, also known as a solar storm during an Apollo mission, that also could have led to serious radiation sickness issues. And the reason mannequins were sent to the moon on Artemis 1 is, first of all, to take more exact radiation measurements than were taken back in the 60s and 70s. But also, number 2, this was a brand new rocket and a brand new spacecraft. Do we really want to risk living human beings on a brand new ship like that? We weren't even willing to take those kinds of risks back in the Apollo era, let alone today after the Challenger and Columbia disasters. And what about the extremes of temperature on the moon? The same temperature extremes exist in space as the temperature extremes that exist on the moon. If the International Space Station is traveling through space at a time when it is shaded, when there is no sunlight, the temperatures drop in a colossal fashion. And then when the sun comes back out, temperatures heat up radically and quickly. The same sorts of phenomena take place in space as do on the moon. There's really no difference. So if extreme temperature problems would prevent humans from setting down on the moon, then how the hell would they not also prevent us from having astronauts on the International Space Station? And also, let's talk about the micrometeoroid issue. Are there micrometeoroids hitting the surface of the moon? Undoubtedly. Do they hit the moon frequently enough to where Apollo astronauts would have been pelted with them on a regular basis? Well, if that was indeed the case, that would mean that every unmanned probe, every robot that we have sent to the surface of the moon, and by the way, not just us and not just the Soviet Union, but also China's done it, the Indians have done it, all of those probes would have gotten pelted by micrometeoroids as well and taken out of action. And do you know how many robotic probes have been disabled by micrometeoroids on the surface of the moon? 0. Up to this point, none have been disabled by micrometeoroids. Is a micrometeoroid dangerous? Yes, indeed. But are these things hitting the surface of the moon so frequently that they would be dangerous to astronauts? Absolutely not. Yeah, sure, on some occasions it could be lethal, but the odds are heavily, heavily against it. Oh yeah, and also let's talk a little bit about Bert Psycho's views on how much fuel it would require to get out to the moon. Once again, taking advantage of uninformed people. Here he is talking about the number of refueling missions it requires Starship to get out to the moon.
And then he said with a taller rocket than the Saturn V, he's going to take at least minimum 8 fuel trips to go to the moon. And
Can you find out where he said that, Steve?
Well, yeah, and then we're actually going to show a NASA scientist saying it may take even more than that.
What does the headline say?
Yeah.
Elon Musk says it could take 8 Starship launches to fuel up a single moon trip.
And this is with a rocket that's slightly taller than the Saturn V.
So are we seeing a pattern here? Taking scientific facts, a few of them anyway, and headlines out of context and using them to deceive uninformed people. Like, I guess, presumably, the host of this podcast. Because if anybody's listening who knows anything about Starship, which I would say would probably be a substantial portion of my audience, you know why all of these refueling trips are necessary. It's because Starship is taller than Saturn V. It's a massive rocket designed to carry 100 metric tons to the moon or to Mars. Far more than Apollo ever did. And therefore, you can't get to the moon with 100 metric tons worth of cargo with a single tank of fuel. It's not that Starship isn't more advanced technology than Saturn V, because it is, but the objective that it's trying to accomplish is far more ambitious than any of the Apollo missions tried to carry out. Instead of taking a couple of tons and 2 astronauts down to the moon, this thing is supposed supposed to take dozens of astronauts to Mars. You can't do that on one tank of gas. So after all of these misconceptions, all of this twisted, manipulative, and misrepresented data, what is the most compelling fact about all of this that debunks the notion that the moon landings were faked? Well, it's simply because of the massive array of not only people, but also nations that would have had to have participated. Not just Western nations, but also the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War, because the Soviet Union, utilizing tracking systems, tracked the Apollo 11 capsule all the way to the moon. Had they simply dumped the Apollo into the ocean after a couple of orbits of the Earth, or tried to pull some other kind of stunt, well, they wouldn't have gotten away with it. Oh yeah, and also, Bert Psycho shared some blurry photographs of Apollo in orbit to demonstrate or prove the whole conspiracy theory that Apollo never left orbit and eventually splashed down in the ocean as part of the entire scam. Well, here's the thing. Apollo did orbit Earth once. The Apollo 9 mission, when all the spacecraft, including the lunar lander, were put through their paces. And actually, the spacecraft separated. The astronauts actually did a spacewalk as well. Of course, these aren't blurry photographs. NASA isn't hiding anything here. They did have an Apollo mission that stayed in Earth orbit in order to test all the technology before they sent everything hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. Once again, assuming that that blurry photograph is actually genuine and not a fake of some kind, prove to me that that's not just a photo of Apollo 9. Once again, manipulating and misrepresenting facts to mislead uninformed people. But the question remains, how did we manage to get to the moon in the late 60s and early 70s, but we can't manage it today with far more advanced technology? Isn't that proof in and of itself? Well, no, not really. And the reason for that is in the late 60s and early 70s, and indeed through the entire decade of the 60s, after Kennedy made his pronouncement to the world that America was going to get to the moon, land a human being there, and bring them back safely by the end of the decade, NASA and the government spent many, many, many billions of dollars getting this accomplished. In today's dollars, NASA's budgets back in the 60s utterly dwarfed what they get today. It isn't even close. So as a result, NASA has been trying to slam a square peg into a round hole by using existing technology for the space shuttle program, which was never designed to get anybody to the moon, to build a new moon rocket. It utilizes the same fuel tank, the same solid rocket boosters, the same everything that the space shuttle did, but it's all had to have been scaled up in order to make a journey to the moon. It hasn't been an easy process, and it hasn't been a cheap process, ironically, even though this was supposed to save money. And in the end, I suppose it actually did compared to what Saturn V's cost us back in the 60s and 70s. So in some ways, the project has succeeded, but not in terms of getting us to the moon in a timely fashion. When you spend this little money compared to what was spent on Apollo in the old days, you're just not going to get the same results. And that applies to the robotic missions that have been going to the moon lately as well. The 4 NASA CLPS missions that have attempted to go to the moon up to this point, the Astrobotic Peregrine, the 2 Intuitive Machines missions, and finally the Firefly Blue Ghost mission, all 4 of those combined do not add up to the cost of a single NASA robotic surveyor mission in the 1960s. And by the way, 2 of NASA's 6 surveyor missions failed as well. So they weren't exactly batting 1,000 back in the old days, and when they failed, they lost a lot more money than these current private missions. But as I was suggesting before, the biggest problem with the whole conspiracy theory, as I see it, is the number of nations that had to have been in on it for it to have worked. So we're talking about a conspiracy that would require the collaboration of not only us, Not only both Republicans and Democrats, but also the Soviet Union, also everybody else who had the radar technology to track Apollo from the moment that it was launched to its entire orbital trajectory and its path to the moon and back. All of this was being watched intently. It would have to require that all of these governments be in on this conspiracy on top of all of the other people who were allegedly involved in it. Why would the Soviets in the middle of the Cold War have collaborated on a conspiracy like this? Well, the fact of the matter is there's no conspiracy that would require that much collaboration and remain a secret. None of this is true, guys. And to all of my fellow YouTubers out there, podcasters, whatever, a lot of you may just not have the knowledge to recognize this bullshit when you see it, but it's not worth the money. It's not worth sabotaging your reputation as a serious podcaster, as a serious news reporter, or whatever you're trying to portray yourself as being. Nobody is going to take you seriously except people who are just completely uninformed on the subject if you continue giving these people a platform. For God's sake, stop. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And also, please continue to support this channel. Continue to support proof and scientifically reasoned videos as opposed to the other nonsense that's out there. All the details are in the description. And until next time, stay angry about space.